Great, welcome everyone to the third in our Women in Climate Change speaking series. This is an event that's supported by the Women in Gender and Sexuality Studies Department here at UMaine, as well as the McGillicuddy Center for the Humanities. So it's great to see you all, and I'd like to start first with a little bit about my own identity. My name is Dr. Katie Glover. I'm here at the Climate Change Institute here at University of Maine. And I'll go ahead and read our land acknowledgement, which recognizes where we are located here on campus. So the University of Maine recognizes that it is located on Marsh Island in the homeland of the Penobscot Nation, where issues of water and territorial rights and encroachment upon sacred sites are ongoing. Penobscot homeland is connected to the other Wabanaki tribal nations, the Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, and Micmac, through kinship, alliances, and diplomacy. The university also recognizes that the Penobscot Nation and the other Wabanaki tribal nations are distinct, sovereign, legal, and political entities with their own powers of self-governance and self-determination. So with that said, I'm really excited to welcome today's speaker, who will be talking about Indigenous Science's activism. Thank you all for joining us today. And Sara Tenamoeata Kahanamoku, with they, she pronouns, is a Kanaka Maoli and Maʻohi Tahitian scientist from the Haleʻiwa, Oʻahu, Hawaii. Like many others in their family, they were raised in the ocean, and it is this relationship that drives their scholarship and activism. Currently, they are a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley, where the research focuses on the impacts of the climate crisis on California's ocean ecosystems during the 19th and 20th centuries. Their applied work also focuses on the pono, equitable, relational, co-production of climate-related research and policy. In their free time, they work to support movements to aloha and malama aina. So Sara, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk with you all. Should I go ahead and start sharing my screen? Okay, great. Let's see. Okay, great. Hopefully you all can see this. So yeah, today I'll be talking about some of the work that I've been doing as an Indigenous scientist on issues surrounding Mauna Kea, and also on some engagement with communities and co-production for the climate crisis. So to start, I kind of wanted to give you an idea of who I am. So o Sara Tenamoeata Kahanamoku ko'u inoa, no Haleʻiwa Oʻahu mai au, o ka'ala ku'u mauna, a me o pupukea ku'u kai. So I'm Sara Tenamoeata Kahanamoku. I'm a Kanaka Maoli or Kanaka Iwi and Maʻohi scientist from Haleʻiwa, which is in the ahupua of Poʻolauloa, which is on the island of Oʻahu in the archipelago of Hawaii. And this picture that I'm showing on the background of the slide is actually the beach that I grew up on. And I wanted to show this because everything that I am as a person and as a scientist is influenced by my time in this particular place. So I use they, she pronouns. That's because in Hawaiian thinking, our genders don't map to the gender binary. And as Katie said, for my day job, I'm an ecosystem scientist. I'm a PhD student at UC Berkeley, which is on Huichin Ohlone land, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people. And in my time here, I study California ocean ecosystem change over the past 2,000 years. And I also, before I start, wanted to make a disclaimer that, like all groups, Kanaka Maoli are not a monolith. So the statements that I make here are not generalizable to every Hawaiian or to every Hawaiian issue. So everything that I say here represents my personal worldview. And this worldview has been shaped by my relationships with specific places, like Keiki Beach, this beach I grew up on, and specific people, and also the knowledge systems that I've been trained in. And as part of introducing myself, I also need to introduce the mo'okuauhau, or the genealogy of the knowledge that I have. So I wanted to recognize some people that have been influential in my education and in this work that I'm doing. Some of these influential relationships include Dr. Rosie Allegado, who's at the top of the screen, and then clockwise from that, Dr. Katie Kumelamela, Dr. Noi Punivai, Dr. Cleola Halamho, Tasha Kawamata Ryan, Dr. Haunani Kane, and Dr. Aurora Kagawa Viviani. All of us work together to advance ideas around pono science, which is the just and equitable and Hawaiian-centered practice of science in Hawaii. And that sign that's in the middle, it says pono science is possible, was made by Kalealaholamho during the 2019 TMT movement to demonstrate that this idea that we can do good and just Hawaiian-led science is really important for building a future for Hawaii. And then I also want to recognize Dr. Antikole Nu'uhiwa, who's in that photo on the bottom right. And she's been super influential in teaching me about Hawaiian thinking and Hawaiian worldviews. So she's like the auntie that I look to whenever I have questions about Hawaiian culture. Okay, so to start out, I wanted to talk a bit about how uncomfortable it can be to be an Indigenous person in science. I think we all kind of know that science has not been good to Indigenous people. And so I wanted to quote from one of Robin Wall Kimmerer's writings. This is an essay called The Fortress, the River, and the Garden, because I think it describes this dilemma of being an Indigenous scientist really well. So Indigenous communities often have a very complicated relationship with science. There might be an intergenerational fear of science that's based in a legacy of colonization and a legacy of a harmful application of science. And science has been experienced as disrespectful to Indigenous rights and sovereignty. But then there's also this perception that if we as Indigenous people participate in scientific professions, we can use our roles and our training to support Indigenous self-governance and land management. So we're kind of stuck in the middle, right? There's like this intergenerational legacy that's been really harmful, but then this potential to maybe use our positions to help to advance self-determination of our nations. And that puts us in a tricky spot. And we're constantly, and I would say increasingly in the modern era, being urged to indigenize science. But this is with the background that we have not yet created mutually beneficial relationships between our different knowledge systems. So there's not enough leaders who are fluent in both, dominant Western science and Indigenous knowledge systems to be able to resolve these very complex questions that come up in terms of scientific colonialism, which are fraught with risks on all sides for every community involved. And so I wanted to just show this quote about how scientific colonialism is a structure, not an event. And that's quoting from a Wolf essay that is, I think, one of the foundational essays in settler colonial studies. But in particular, this quote that Wahia Kea Maoli wrote in 2015 that's quoted in Chanda Prescott Weinstein's paper. I can share these references with everybody later if you'd like. Demonstrates how the history of science is deeply enmeshed in white supremacy. So they write, the history of science and how it's presently practiced is deeply enmeshed with white supremacist traditions regarding who has been constructed as human, who has been seen as meriting freedom, whose minds are worth cultivating intellectually, and whose relationships to land are upheld and valued. I think this is really prominent in the Hawaii context, even just in my time as a scientist. I'm early career, I'm a fourth year PhD student. I've seen portrayals of Native Hawaiians by professional predominant scientists as being anti-science or backwards or unmoved by logic. And it's this type of rhetoric that it's science versus Hawaiian culture that has been used to discredit activists and silence Native Hawaiian concerns when it comes to the use of science to advance colonial agendas. So I just wanted to make sure that we are starting off with this understanding that science has long benefited from colonialism, and this benefit has continued unbroken to today. And over the past few years, I've spent a lot more time than I thought I would thinking about and dealing with the consequences of scientific colonialism in my PhD. And in particular, one of the questions that I've been thinking about a lot is this question about power. So do we as Indigenous people have power to decide what happens to our own homelands? Because the choices made by those who have power, which has tended to be Anglo-European scientists, these choices determine who is granted authority to make decisions for Indigenous people and for Indigenous land, and for the nature and terms of cultural practice on these lands. And this question became particularly personal in the past couple of years with the conflict around Mauna Kea and the 30-meter telescope. So for some background, if the 30-meter telescope were to be built, it would be the largest telescope on Mauna Kea, situated near the summit. And Mauna Kea is one of the most important mountains to Native Hawaiian people. And so there's been this long movement centered on Mauna Kea and its importance to Native Hawaiians to affirm that this is a place that we want to have the power to make decisions for. And the history of astronomy has been incredibly long in Hawaii, so TMT is not the first conflict. But many Native Hawaiians have been organizing opposition to TMT itself since like the earliest phases of the project. I think the first in-person movements were about 8 years ago, but direct action has increased over the past 5 or 6 years as the telescope project continued to push through its stages to reach construction. So this is a photo that I'm showing right now of one of the more recent physical movements on the Mauna, which was in July of 2019. But I wanted to go over some background on the physical stands on the Mauna that Hawaiians have been making. So there's been 2 major physical conflicts to date. The first one began in April 2015, and that was when Mauna Kea Kia'i, and Kia'i is a word that we use to mean protector. So mountain protectors, kind of like water protectors, you may have heard that term. So in April 2015, Kia'i physically blockaded the road to prevent movement of construction equipment up the Mauna. And 31 of those Kia'i were arrested. And so after those arrests, this kind of galvanized a broader movement across the islands. Hundreds more took stands on the Mauna itself, and then there were hundreds of people that made demonstrations at the flagship University of Hawaii campus, which is on Oʻahu, a different island. And so because of all of this movement, Governor Ige was forced to temporarily postpone the project. And then I think shortly afterwards, the Hawaii Supreme Court actually invalidated the TMT's construction permits on a legal technicality that they had failed to meet the requirements of due process. So that kind of ended that phase of having to physically stand for the Mauna, but that stalemate didn't last for very long. And the project continued to push to get more permits. And eventually those permits were awarded. And so the 2019 movement for Mauna Kea began with yet another physical stand against TMT on the Mauna. On July 15th of 2019, 8 Kia'i chained themselves to a cattle guard on the day that construction was supposed to begin again to prevent the movement of construction equipment up the Mauna. And this photo is showing 2 Kia'i, Malia Holman on the left and Jamaica Haoli Osorio on the right, taking a stand physically on that first day. And the movement has been pretty long. So on the next day, July 16th, 2019, a number of our revered kupuna, who are our elders, our cultural knowledge holders, took to the front lines to make a stand for the Mauna, and 33 of them were arrested. This was an incredibly moment for Hawaiians around the world and for our allies who care about Indigenous rights. And so the sacrifices of our kupuna, those who got arrested, and that visual of watching our elders being handled by the state, that helped to galvanize the Native Hawaiian movement that was grounded in kapu aloha, this idea that we stand for the Mauna in a reverence for love. And that ended up drawing individuals by the thousands from around the world to support this movement. So in the month of actually August 2019 alone, 15,000 people visited the Pu'uhonua, which is the base camp, I guess, at the bottom of the Mauna where the movement was situated. 15,000 people is equivalent to about 8% of the population of Hawaii Island. So that's a lot. And because of all of this massive swelling support, the governor of Hawaii, again, he declared a temporary state of emergency, which granted heightened power to law enforcement. And it actually provided the possibility of deploying the National Guard in direct support of a research endeavor. And they came in for training, they brought their sound cannons and crazy heavy equipment. And all of this was to push through a science project. So I hope that helped to make scientists think about the legacy of scientific colonialism today. But in the face of all of this violence, I think Kia'i consider this moment to actually be a state of emergence for Hawaiian people. And that's because the events that happened on the Mauna were incredibly violent, but they also brought together the Hawaiian people in a way that we haven't seen in many years. And so it's in this generative space instead of that violent space. It's in this generative space that I want to think about lessons that we can learn from the movement for Mauna Kea and how we can apply these to other issues where colonialism and science and indigeneity intersect. Okay, so let's see if I can make this work. I wanted to show about 4-minute video of Uncle Kaleko Kaeo and Uncle Walter Riddy talking about the movement for Mauna Kea as they're chained to a cattle guard on July 15th. And I thought this video gives a really good overview of the issues surrounding the Mauna movement, and also a view of how generative it's been. And as you're listening to this video, I want you to notice how the uncles explicitly talk about the role of universities and the role of science in violating Native Hawaiian rights. Oh, let's see. Turn on captions.
Ehina, ohe oi panemai.
Kupuna up there.
Yeah. I mean that's really the most powerful image that we can share around the world, is the plight of our people, and our cultural integrity, is held by our kupuna. And so our goal, of course, is to expose that, not just to Hawaii, but really to the rest of the world, that there's something rotten going on in Hawaii.
Can you hear the sound? Okay, great. I will continue.
Whether it's David Lasner and the University of Hawaii, who pimp out our lands, to these foreign entities, Japan, China, India, Canada, Caltech, all being protected and supported by the University of Hawaii, who lease land from the so-called state of Hawaii, who manages lands on so-called these are lands that belong to our people. These are our people's lands, yet we're fighting against a subleaser. Well, I think they got a sublease at this point. They didn't have one for a long time. But think about that. And the state of Hawaii is using this large police and military force to threaten really our people, to subdue our people in a way, to really cause us to be tamed, so they can continue on this process of exploiting our sacred sites, our lands, our waters in many ways to these corporations. And that's really what's going on. It's that they really don't want Hawaiians thinking and being Hawaiian, because it's in direct conflict to the kind of exploitation and the kind of greedy, self-righteous mentality that's running rampant throughout the world. What you see in Hawaii is no different than what we just saw in Standing Rock. What you see going on in the unceded territories in Canada, those who are fighting the pipelines, whether it's the natives of Papua who are fighting the nickel and copper mines, or in Australia. I mean, this is something that's going around the world. And so we know the truth. We know we're under an illegal occupation. We know this land, in fact, this land we're right here on, this land belongs to us. I know none of the so-called investors in the TMT have any interest in these lands. But all of us here, you see laying down here, we all have an undivided 1/3 interest as the vested rights of what's called the Hawaiian in these lands. And so, in fact, if you talk to me, we're very educated. We are not people who are uneducated, and that's really why we understand we need to do this. We don't have any other choice but to, at this moment in time, if we're going to live on as people, we have to demand our humanity. We can no longer be dehumanized by those who refuse to accept that we all should be treated equal in this world. And that's really what this is about. The right for a people to be a people in their own homeland. Where else can Hawaiians be Hawaiians? Where else are Hawaiians going to have a sacred lands? Where else are Hawaiians going to have waters and land and healthy land to grow food and fish from the sea to fish, but from our own homeland?
Okay, so hopefully you could hear that video. If you couldn't, it's called Chained to the Cattle Guard. And I just wanted to, share it because I think that the uncles show that there are so many intersecting issues that are being addressed on the Mauna. Issues of Indigenous rights, of land rights, of conservation, of cultural perpetuation, scientific colonialism. All these things are coming together. So it was with all of this happening in the background that those of us that are Hawaiians in science, we're trying to figure out how to support the movement from our professional positions. So I know that those that are in Katie's class read this paper that I helped to write with some other folks on the impacts of the 30-meter telescope on Native Hawaiians from a scientist perspective. So a group of us were able to submit a number of papers to the National Academy of Sciences because they actually go through this every 10 years. They go through a decadal review on the state of astronomy and astrophysics. This year it was called Astro 2020. I guess it's last year. Time is a blur. But anyway, so initially we had been tapped about a week out of this panel by a colleague of a colleague, because this person had realized that this decadal review was coming together that would determine the fate of funding for the field of astronomy for the next 10 years. But all of the papers that talked about the 30-meter telescope and its pros and cons were written by non-Hawaiians. So there was no Hawaiian viewpoint on the impacts of the telescope on our community. So we had initially been asked by this person who was sitting on a panel that was reviewing this to submit talking points that they could bring to the panel just to make sure that our voice was being heard. But a collective of us came together and within the course of a week and a half actually ended up writing 8 different policy papers that overviewed the impact of the 30-meter telescope on Hawaiians from a bunch of different perspectives. So mine was from the Hawaiian scientist perspective that I led with Rosie Allegado and Aurora Kagawa Viviani and Katie Kamelamela, and then also Hawaiian astronomer Brittany Kamai and a number of our non-Hawaiian allies who have been really fantastic. But there were also papers on Hawaiian law, on the impact of TMT on ecological and cultural practices in Hawaii, and all of these things. And I think chief among our recommendations to the National Academy of Sciences was the recommendation that TMT stop construction and work to improve the relationship between professional astronomers and Native Hawaiians. So if you want to read those papers, I've included a link to them. They're hosted on a Figshare. Mine is also on Archive. But if you want to read all 8 of those papers, I would recommend going to the Figshare. You can also search Mauna Kea Figshare. I think we're the only one on there. Okay, so I wanted to go over some foundational concepts that I talk about in that paper, because these are foundational concepts that underlie many Hawaiian movements, especially the movement for Mauna Kea. And I think in order to understand why this has been such a big flashpoint, we need to understand some of the 4 concepts that underlie our activism and our science. So the first phrase, which maybe you heard in the video, is this term aloha aina. And so Hawaiian isn't actually directly translatable to English. I think some folks, instead of calling translations from Hawaiian into English translations, we call them vigorous or rigorous paraphrases. There's no real way to capture what each term means. So some paraphrases of aloha aina include terms like love of the land, respect for the land, and then some people also call it patriotism, not like the patriotism we see in the US, I don't think. But it basically stems from this idea that land is an ancestor to the Hawaiian people. So as Kanaka Maoli, we can trace our genealogy back to the land. We are lineal descendants from it. And we view land as a source of life and identity. So as we are perpetuating aloha aina, we understand that our well-being and the well-being of the land are interdependent. You can't have one without the other. You can't have Hawaiians without Hawaii. You can't have Hawaii without Hawaiians. So I see aloha aina personally as a relational perspective on our individual and collective responsibilities and privileges to each other and to land. And I wanted to try to define relationality here. It's kind of a difficult thing for me to define. But for this context, I view relationality as centering relationships and constructing understanding. So that can be centering interpersonal relationships, centering your relationship between a person and the land, or centering relationships between different parts of the land to each other, all those things. So this, relational view of the world, I think, really helps to demonstrate why Mauna Kea is so important. So Mauna Kea is considered Aina Aloha, right? It's beloved land. It's Kanaka Maoli ancestral land. It's one of the most sacred places in the Hawaiian archipelago. And it's also a piko, which is a site of convergence for the Hawaiian nation. And I know that scientists don't always use the term sacred. So I wanted to define what sacredness is. It's kind of undefinable, but it comes in many forms in my worldview. So the mauna is sacred because it's a genealogical ancestor to the Hawaiian people. It's also a place of worship. But in addition to these things, it's a home. People live on the mauna. People are buried on the mauna. It's considered Kapiko Kaulana o Ka'aina, the famous center of the land. Our bones are there. It's also a critical watershed for Hawaii Island, and it's a tropical alpine ecosystem that harbors endemic life. So that also makes it sacred. And in addition, it's a place of excellence. I view it as a place of educational excellence. In the movement for Mauna Kea, there have been so much, so like many things generated in the academy and outside of the academy, so much education going on by Hawaiians for Hawaiians. It's also a place of personal excellence. If you come to the Mauna and you want to make a movement for the Hawaiian people, you better be excellent. It cannot be detrimental to the movement. And it's also a place of generative excellence because we just constantly are seeing new things coming out of this movement and our care for this place. So there are layers and layers and layers of the importance of Mauna Kea to Kanaka Maoli and to everybody in Hawaii, like not just Hawaiians find Mauna Kea to be a special place. So maybe just knowing about these two things, aloha aina and the importance of Mauna Kea, you can imagine that TMT is a particularly difficult and emotional issue for Hawaiians. But it's actually only the most recent issue regarding Mauna Kea use. Astronomy on the Mauna has been fraught since the very beginning in about the 1960s. And this conflict is set up because Mauna Kea is one of the best places in the world for ground-based astronomy. So there are currently, I think, 13 telescope complexes that produce the majority of data collected in the Northern Hemisphere that all sit atop the Mauna. So if you're an astronomer or you even just look at astronomy information, if that comes from the Northern Hemisphere, it's probably coming from Mauna Kea. And I wanted to note that astronomy on the Mauna is scientific colonialism. It's another branch of a long-lasting trend of difficult interactions between Hawaiians and the colonizing state, I guess. So astronomy on Mauna Kea is like the direct result of US takeover of Hawaii and the appropriation of the personal lands of the last reigning monarch of Hawaii. And for those who don't know, Hawaii used to be a kingdom before the US seized Hawaiian lands and overthrew the monarchy in 1893. And as a result of this, our lands, our cultural resources, our ability to have self-determination were taken away. And all of this has had long-lasting and detrimental impacts on all aspects of Native Hawaiian life. So it's with this background that the relationship between institutional astronomy and Native Hawaiians came to be. And because of that unbalance of power, there has been many tensions since the construction of the first telescopes in 1960. Okay, and among all of the many violent expressions of colonialism that are present in the islands, Mauna Kea has become particularly visible because of these dynamics, right? So it demonstrates that the separation of Native Hawaiian cultural practitioners from Mauna Kea and from other important places in Hawaii, and the separation of Hawaiians from sovereignty and self-determination and mismanagement of land, all these things just heighten existing trauma. And so these uneven dynamics on the Mauna set the stage for the TMT conflict that we've been seeing over the past couple of years. So many astronomers view their work as inherently nonviolent and in the interest of humanity, right? If you don't work with people, how can it be violent? Power dynamics are at play. And then on the other hand, many Kanaka assert that Indigenous rights to self-determination are under siege, while astronomers are directly benefiting from the disenfranchisement of Native Hawaiians. And I wanted to note that, like all things, these groups are not mutually exclusive. So there are Kanaka Maoli astronomers, some of whom support TMT, and some of whom support the movement for Mauna Kea. So it's this very complex issue that I think, again, comes back to this question of power. So at the heart of the disconnect is that same question that I keep asking myself. The choices made on Mauna Kea reflect who's granted authority to make decisions for Native Hawaiians, for contested lands, and for the nature and terms of cultural practice on these lands. So who has the power to make decisions for Indigenous people? And as a brief update on where we are now, the movement for Mauna Kea is still ongoing. So physical action on the Mauna died down due to an agreement with the state that I think was to extend until February, but then COVID hit. So now it's been about a year since we've had any physical conflicts, or more than that. But Kea remain extremely committed to the protection of Mauna Kea. So I think it's been about over 640 days since July 2019 protecting the Mauna, and over 8 years since the first community actions against TMT. However, the TMT project itself remains extremely committed to being in Hawaii, even though there are alternate sites. And despite the fact that there is no consent among Native Hawaiian people for the 30-meter telescope. The most recent survey of Native Hawaiians that actually had a pretty decent sample size showed that over 87% of Native Hawaiians oppose the telescope going on the Mauna. And those of us who are working in all kinds of different areas of life continue to affirm the importance of Mauna Kea in our work. So like I said, among Kanaka Maoli professional scientists, our work has brought the fight to protect Mauna Kea to the highest funding levels in science. We actually released that suite of 8 papers during the annual meeting of the American Astronomical Society in Honolulu in December of 2019, I think. And those papers, the goal of those was to ensure that no federal money was being used to build on state land without the consent of Indigenous people. And the reason we did that is because federal money is what projects like this really need. So again, those policy papers that we wrote were written from a Hawaiian perspective on the impacts of TMT on Native Hawaiian law and cultural and traditional practices and environmental impacts. And I don't think I actually mentioned this, but this was the first time in the over 200-year history of professional astronomy that any input on the field's impact on non-astronomers was sought out. So this panel was called the State of the Profession panel, and it sought out to broadly listen to communities that worked with astronomers and hear about the impacts of science, of astronomy on non-science, non-astronomy communities. So I'm very glad that they did this, and I hope that this continues. But again, the question of power, who holds the power, hasn't been settled at all, and the Mauna Kea movement is not over. In fact, I think this movement will always continue until the very last aloha aina, until the project moves or something else happens. And so as someone who works in climate science, the movement for Mauna Kea has been really inspiring for me, both professionally and personally, because I think it shows really clearly that issues of power in science have significant and long-lasting consequences for people and for places. So I think there's actually a number of lessons that we can learn from the Mauna as we seek to address the climate crisis in an equitable way. I think there are 2 big things that it has taught me, at least. It shows that you need place-based solutions for place-based problems, right? So we need in Hawaii, Kanaka Maoli solutions for Kanaka Maoli places and Kanaka Maoli issues. The movement for Mauna Kea was led by Hawaiians because it's a Hawaiian issue on Hawaiian land. So it's place-based. I think we also need to develop solutions that are local and Indigenous. And I wanted to include this reminder here from Dr. Troy Storfgel and Dr. Zoe Todd. They both have really great tweets about indigeneity and all kinds of things. This idea that Indigenous is not actually an identity, it's an analytic, right? So indigeneity describes a set of relationships to colonialism and to anti-colonialism and to specific lands and places, whereas an identity is something like Kanaka Maoli. I'm Native Hawaiian, that's my identity. I'm also Indigenous, that's the analytic that I use to view my world and to place my work into context. So anyway, I think these 2 things are really important because with place-based Indigenous solutions, I think we can start to address the climate crisis in an equitable way that works really well for specific places. So that's what I want to spend the rest of my time talking about. I feel that the needs of a successful climate movement can be similar to those of Indigenous sovereignty movements. They're not the same, context matters, but I think that there are similarities that we can pick up on and learn from. And so some of these include things like relationality, which we've already talked about a bit, a land base, the need for Indigenous knowledge, the need for long-term thinking. I call it here 40 and 400-year thinking because Hawaiians think in 4s and 10s. That's antiquated, taught me that and I love it. But yeah, the need for long-term thinking, and also the need for an abundance mindset and a community to do this work. So I'll go into detail on each of these points in the following slides, just so I can illustrate how I see Indigenous sovereignty as laying out a path towards successfully mitigating and adapting to and being resilient and relentless in our approach to the climate crisis. Okay, so I wanted to start with relationality because I think this is the most foundational example of a core aspect of a sovereignty movement that's applicable to the climate crisis as well. So as a reminder, earlier I defined relationality as centering relationships and constructing understanding. And basically what this means is that where we come from and our upbringing and our important relationships and our lived experiences all shape how we interact with the world, right? So understanding our own personal viewpoints, which can be our positionality, this can help us understand the core values and the beliefs and the biases that we bring with us into any interaction. So I wanted to show this photo again, because this place, Keiki Beach, is a strong aspect of who I am, and this has determined how I've interacted with the world. And one example of Hawaiian relationality that I think illustrates how we construct our worldview and why aloha aina is such an important concept is this idea that we trace genealogical descent from the islands and also from akua, which some people translate as gods, but Antipolani Kanaka Maoli Kanahele translates as natural phenomena or elemental forms. So things like the sun, water, plants, stuff like that, and other life forms. So there are a number of creation stories in Hawaiian cosmogony that trace our descent from things like the islands and the natural elements and other life forms. And one of those stories is the story of Haloa. So I've included a photo here, or an illustration by Solomon Enos, that shows how this story happens. And it's included in the Kumulipo, which is one of the big Hawaiian cosmogenic creation chants, and also in a number of other places, including in the Melehano of Ko'i Keauli, which is the birth chant of Kamehameha III, Ko'i Keauli. And this story is about the creation of the first man. So we start out with Wakea, who can be seen as the sky father maybe, and Papa, who can be seen as the earth. And together they have Ho'ohoku Kalani, a child who is the night sky. And Ho'ohoku Kalani has a child named Haloa. But the first, as she has this child, he is born stillborn. So this is the first Haloa, and she wraps him in a blanket and buries him in the earth. And after she buries him, from where he was buried, a taro sprouts up, a taro plant. And so Haloa is the first taro plant. And then Ho'ohoku Kalani has another child, and this one she also names Haloa, and he is not born stillborn. So this Haloa is the first person. He is the first chief. He's an ali'i, Hanau Haloa he ali'i. And so this shows that we as Hawaiian people who come from this first person Haloa are the younger sibling of our staple food, the taro plant, and the younger children of the islands and the elements. And then also in this chant, you see the lines Hanau ka mauna, he keiki mauna na Kea. And that's mauna Kea, mauna awa Kea. So it shows that Mauna Kea is also born. We are related to the mauna as well. So I really like this story. That was like a, very short overview of a very, very long and beautiful story. But I think that it's important because it emphasizes one aspect of our relationality, which is that Hawaiian knowledge is rooted in the natural environment. And we use mo'okuauhau, which I translate sometimes as genealogy, but Anti-Kulenuʻuhiwa translates as a genealogical map of origins, like this web of relationships, to understand our world and to help build the rules of the world that we live in, right? So these stories that we use to define ourselves help to determine what concepts and what values we think are the most important. So for example, this genealogy, our genealogical descent from the land, means that we carry the kuleana, which is the responsibility and also the privilege of having a familial relationship to land. And that familial relationship has certain rules. It means that, you know, just as we would care for our parents, we need to care for the land. And in return, just as our parents would care for us, the land will care for us. So these stories help us build our world. And this is why Hawaiian is so important and why relationality is so important to understand. So coming from this background, it was a hard transition to go into science, right? So even though it's clear that having a relationship-centered approach, like that understanding of where we as Hawaiians come from, that can help us extend our understanding, right? It can, if you go into science with a relationship-centered approach, it can extend how you as a scientist work with a community beyond something that's just transactional. But it's kind of hard to bring relationality into academic science. Current scientific and professional training usually lacks a relational emphasis, right? So we primarily focus on analytic technique and on the perception of objectivity. And there's little formal training that we get to work with conflict and to work with the emotions that come up as we're doing difficult work, like working on the climate crisis. And that's a quote from actually a paper that I'm writing with Katie right now that hopefully will come out soon. And I also wanted to plug a book by my colleague Faith Kearns that's coming out in May called Getting to the Heart of Science Communication, because I think it talks really well to this point that, you know, in science, our training often lacks a relational emphasis, yet it's really clear that relationality can enhance how we view and understand the world and enhance how we work with the people around us, you know, to advance the causes that we think are most important, like addressing the climate crisis. And I think one of the core points that it's important to understand, you know, is that science is not objective, right? It's done by us human beings who come in with our relationships and our personal background, and we bring that into our scientific practice, even if we don't recognize it. And relationality is really hard work. Faith talks about this a lot in her book. It's super emotional. You have to deal with conflict, and that can kind of suck. And so it requires scientists and basically anybody who wants to go into their work with a relational worldview to step beyond the norms and practices that we are trained to uphold and instead view relationality as an important aspect of getting our work done. And it's, I think, important to do this really hard, the hard work of bringing relationality in, because we need this for the climate crisis, right? The climate crisis is an all hands on deck scenario. Everybody needs to be addressing it. And in order to address it well, we need the explicit and the equitable involvement of everyone that is affected by it. And I personally think that one of the best ways to do this is by centering relationships and building trust with the communities that are most impacted by the climate crisis, right? So we hear this term sometimes, frontline communities. These are people whose future will be shaped by climate action or shaped by climate inaction. And I think relationality can help to transform climate science and, you know, science communication and decision making and all these things that tend to try to separate people from science into a more equitable and reciprocal and iterative conversation between the communities who are living through this and the people who are sometimes making the decisions for them. And I would actually advocate for us going much further than that, right? So I think that in order to have true relationality, in order to have a true relational science practice, and to address climate change equitably, we need to let communities do the leading, right? And that's because I think the ultimate goal of relational practice is to develop broader initiatives that are directly supporting frontline communities and also are driven by their needs and their goals. Scientists can't always make the decisions because we don't know what communities need. Okay, and I think one example of this, something that communities need that is a core aspect of a sovereignty movement, that's also applicable to the climate crisis is this need for a land base, right? So some of us may have heard of this idea of land back. If you haven't, it's a simple idea. The land that we're on is Indigenous land that was stolen and that Indigenous people have been systematically excluded from, so give it back. And sometimes you hear about land back as an important concept for cultural revitalization, right? And that's because for many Hawaiians and for many other Indigenous people around the world who are deeply connected to land, you need a land base to perpetuate your cultural practice and to retain your identity, right? You can't have Hawaii without Hawaiians. You can't have Hawaiians without Hawaii. And I think it goes further than this too, right? We also need land back for ecological revitalization. I think you hear Indigenous people talk about this as well. We know that land and also ocean will be impacted, so we need to be able to work on it and work near it to be able to mitigate those impacts or address them. And so we again come back to this question, who has authority over land and who's allowed to manage it? I would say that the current US system of management is often based on less than 200 years of scientific study, right? So we come in bringing these scientific ideas that are relatively young compared to Indigenous management systems, which are based on thousands to tens of thousands of years of intimate and holistic relationships with land. And then, like I've been talking about, I think ecological and cultural revitalization are often the same thing. And that's because I really like this quote by Dr. Adrienne Keene, who is one of the co-hosts of a podcast called All My Relations, which is this idea that healing the land is healing ourselves as Indigenous people. We're the same thing, you can't separate us out. So I think having a land base in the climate crisis is really important, right? And there is actually a related idea to this in what I would call the dominant scientific thinking, which is this idea of a resource management area. But I actually don't think that this captures what it means to have a land base. And that's because a lot of times resource management areas tend to view people as something separate from land. But we know through scientific study that Indigenous territories steward biodiversity. For example, Indigenous territories make up about 22% of the world's land surface, but contain 80% of worldwide biodiversity. So having Indigenous people on land is really important for improving our ability to conserve biodiversity around the world. And I wanted to include a quote from this paper called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor by Tuck and Yang, because I think that recently I've been hearing a lot about decolonizing science, decolonizing conservation, bringing these decolonial ideas into our work to address the climate crisis and our daily lives as scientists and as people. So I wanted to remind us that decolonization is not a metaphor. What it means is to give land back, right? So decolonization in places that are in a settler colonial regime this has to involve the repatriation of land, in addition to the recognition of how land and people's relationships to land have always and already been differently understood and enacted. So basically, we need to give land back and also recognize that Indigenous people cannot be separated from land. And we need to not do this symbolically. You can't have decolonization without land return. And I would argue that you can't have a good stewardship of biodiversity in the climate crisis without Indigenous land sovereignty and Indigenous political sovereignty, right? Because we know that Indigenous people have this very complex and rich knowledge that is important for stewarding biodiversity. And without allowing us to actually lead, then climate crisis management will not be as effective. Okay, on to the next point. So another thing that I think sovereignty movements utilize that can be really critical for addressing the climate crisis is this idea of Indigenous knowledge. I think a lot of people in science might be familiar with this term. I actually think Indigenous knowledge is a blanket term that is not always the best used in particular contexts. It's a blanket term for any Indigenous epistemology, any Indigenous way of thinking. So in Hawaii, instead of saying Indigenous knowledge, I use the term ike kupuna, which means ancestor knowledge. And this falls under that blanket term. And two aspects of ike kupuna that are really important are the ideas that it's both place-based and it's intergenerational, right? So Ike kupuna is place-based. Ancestral knowledge is place-based because what happens in one area may not happen in another area. And I think that oftentimes when we think about place-based knowledge, the people who hold this knowledge are people that are practitioners on land. And they're not always recognized as professionals with important and legitimate knowledge and expertise, yet they hold this really rich and complex and critically needed knowledge of the fine details of a particular place that we need to be able to understand that place and understand how it's going to change under the climate crisis. And then another aspect of Ike kupuna is that it's intergenerational. So it really compactly transmits generations of information from way far in the past to now. Actually, Auntie Kaleni Uhiwa often says that the most complex and information-rich chants are those that are just a few lines long. You can spend your entire life trying to understand what a couple lines of Hawaiian language are trying to tell you and never really get there. But anyway, I think it shows that these two aspects show that most place-based practitioners who hold this knowledge are utilizing and also updating with their own observations knowledge about the environment that's based on an extensive foundation of information about and a holistic relationship with a specific local system and specific local natural history that stems from millennia of ecological inquiry like this. So obviously, Ike kupuna would be really useful to help identify compatible, place-based, long-term, and sustainable solutions for addressing the climate crisis. And there are some similar ideas in traditional dominant science, ideas of prediction and adaptation and resilience, these words that I keep throwing around. For example, things like the fossil record or the historical record, which is what I work on in my research, capture place-based and historical ecological information, just like Indigenous and relational storytelling traditions. So maybe scientists aren't familiar with this type of tradition, but it's very similar to something that is very common in dominant science. I would say, though, that Indigenous, relational, and storytelling traditions go further because they transmit cultural knowledge and values. And it's really clear, that cultural knowledge and those values are really important for developing place-based solutions to our place-based problems. I've seen lately a number of papers touting traditional ecological knowledge in fancy journals, and I think that these tend to gloss over the fact that, this type of knowledge is really rooted in a specific place, and it's intergenerational and it's relational. So unless you are of that place and of that community, it's going to be really hard for you to access it, and you probably won't be able to understand it. And I think that that can sometimes be a barrier for people who want to have global problems to the climate crisis, because Indigenous knowledge is not generalizable and it's not scalable. What applies in one place can't be spread to the entire world. And it also requires a relationship that Western scientists can't get through academic training, right? You need to have that cultural context and oftentimes that genealogy, those responsibilities to understand it. So it can't just be parachute style. Like if you want to work with Indigenous people and use traditional ecological knowledge, you can't just come in and expect to be able to understand everything. So I think that what that means is we need to follow the true experts in this situation. These are going to be people like elders, our cultural knowledge holders, activists, farmers and fishers who work in a specific place day by day, and kama'aina, which is a Hawaiian term for people that are intimately familiar with land. And I think that Indigenous relational practices are really useful because when cultural knowledge and values are centered in a community-driven conservation practice, they can help to make these conservation efforts sustainable long-term. So it's important for us to keep in mind. Okay, and this kind of long-term thinking drives many sovereignty movements, and it also drives Hawaiian cultural relationships to place, right? So as an example, in Hawaiian culture, many actions are taken for the benefit of future generations. So for example, in the older days before contact, when people would harvest a koa tree, they would plant a koa tree, and they would plant it not for themselves, but for the people who would live 400 years in the future, so they could also carve a va'a or a canoe out of the tree. And the same thing goes for modern sovereignty movements. When we stand for Mauna Kea, or we stand for Hawaiian self-determination, we do this knowing that our descendants will benefit from this movement. Maybe we won't live to see a day where we regain our self-determination, but our descendants will. And I like this quote from Apeli Hauofa to talk about how this is a practice in the Pacific, right? Those that maintain that the people of Oceania live from day to day, not really caring for the long-term benefits, are unaware of this elementary truth known by most native islanders, that they plan for generations for the continuity and improvement of their families and their kin groups. And it's this type of long-term planning that I think is really important for addressing the climate crisis. We need 40-year thinking and we need 400-year thinking. There are related ideas, long-term strategies and sustainability, these terms that we hear a lot. And in science, it's not that uncommon to think long-term, right? So from paleosciences, for example, we have this understanding that the accelerating anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions that we're producing have transformed Earth's climate in less than 200 years and reversed this 50 million year long cooling trend in what amounts to a geological second. So we know, looking back long-term, that there's this history that we can also continue to address. So I think that we also need to be looking forward long-term, right? Long-term sustainability requires us to think far into the future, and knowledge and planning that span generations to millennia, both forwards and backwards, the future and the past, are critical for mitigating climate change and promoting ecological and community resilience. But I think one of the big caveats is that this type of long-term planning relies on committed engagement with places. It has to be place-based and it has to be committed because you need to work with the communities where this is happening, right? So you need long-term policies and long-term commitments to specific ecosystems and specific communities, just like we see in Indigenous sovereignty movements. Okay, and then a framing that I think is important to have in advancing any movement as we think about all these things, you know, relationality, a land base, Indigenous knowledge, long-term thinking, is this idea of having an abundance mindset. So in Hawaii, I view this as stemming from a concept called aina momona, which is this idea that land is rich and abundant and plentiful. And I wanted to note that the word aina, which is the word for land in Hawaii, can translate to that which feeds. So it's this view that land is abundant. It's there for us to be in relationship with and thrive on. So this abundance mindset is a generative way of thinking. I think I used that term generative at the beginning of the presentation, talking about the mauna. It's basically opposition to scarcity, right? So instead of thinking that we don't have enough, this land is not enough, there's a deficit that we need to address. It's instead this viewpoint that we actually have the regenerative capacity to cultivate abundance. Auntie Candace Fujikani wrote about that in this book that's coming out that I will show you on the next slide. But this idea of an abundance mindset, I think, is really important for Indigenous sovereignty movements and particularly for the climate crisis, right? So we know that in Hawaii, for example, when we manage land, we're managing for abundance and we're managing it for use by people. We're not just trying to increase population numbers to see how high the numbers can go. Like if there's, 10,000 fish in the sea, that's not going to be very useful for people and for ecosystems, right? So in managing ecosystems, the goal is to increase population sizes so we can return to relationships with them through use and perpetuate abundance throughout the place that we're in. So I mentioned Auntie Candace Fujikani wrote this book called Mapping Abundance for a Planetary Future. Auntie Candace she calls herself a settler aloha aina. So she's not Hawaiian, but she is aligned with Hawaiian sovereignty movements. And it's been really lovely for me to read this as someone who struggles every day to have an abundance mindset because, I work on climate change related things and it can be really scary. This idea of scarcity is hard to let go of. So I love this book because it gives many examples of how Kanaka Maoli embody an abundance mindset in our work for Aina. And I wanted to read this as one of the last quotes that I read in this presentation to give us an idea of how we can use abundance to move forward through the climate crisis and create a generative future. So Auntie Candace writes that the struggle for a planetary future calls for a profound epistemological shift. Indigenous ancestral knowledges are now providing a foundation for our work against climate change, one that's based on Indigenous economies of abundance, as opposed to capitalist economies of scarcity. So rather than seeing climate change as apocalyptic, we can see that it makes way for Indigenous lifeways that center familial relationships with the earth and with elemental forms. Kanaka Maoli are restoring the worlds where their capacity for adaptation, regeneration, and transformation will enable them to survive what capital cannot. And I really love this quote, ancestral abundance feeds for generations. I think that's what the abundance mindset is about. Okay, and finally, I think this point is almost self-explanatory, but in any movement, a movement for sovereignty, a movement for addressing the climate crisis, you need community, right? A movement needs people, land needs people, and people need people to be able to do things together. And I put up these two images because I think, to me at least, they show really good examples of community. The one on the right is a photo at Pu'uhuluhulu, which is the base of Mauna Kea, where the movement was centered, showing some of the people that came to the Mauna in July during the height of that physical conflict in 2019. And then the photo on the left is an image of a workday at Haleʻiwa Fish Pond, which is a restored fish pond on the east side of Oʻahu that is being used for indigenous aquaculture, so to produce abundance in our management of the ocean. So I think finding and building and supporting community is incredibly important to addressing the climate crisis because communities do the work. And there are some related ideas in traditional science. Community-centered co-production is one that I've talked a bit about. But I wanted to make it clear that in the context of Indigenous communities addressing the climate crisis, we're already leading the way, right? There are already so many people that are working on creating abundance in addressing the impacts of climate change on their communities. So I have another quote from Epeli Hauofa. This is again from his essay, Our Sea of Islands. It was published in 1993. And it says, the future for Oceania, our Sea of Islands, lies in the hands of our own people, not for those who would prescribe for us and get us forever dependent and indebted because they can see no way out. So I think it's important to remember that in doing work on places, you need to work with the communities who know what they're doing, who already have a vision of the future, and who are already doing this work. That tends to be the Indigenous people. So centering the perspectives of frontline communities and incorporating diverse knowledge systems and worldviews during our research and our decision-making surrounding the climate crisis, it can really help make this research be abundant, right? And it also shows respect for these groups that have been continuously misrepresented and excluded in our practice of science since in the colonial practice of science. And I guess somewhat selfishly, it also makes the work of climate adaptation itself more robust, right? When you prioritize a community's expertise in addressing their own needs and goals, then the solutions are going to be much richer. But it's important to remember that building community is really hard work. It takes time, it takes effort, and it takes a large amount of humility, but it's really worth it. I think there's so much room for generation and so much abundance that we can help to promote, and we're really lucky to have our communities to do this with. Okay, so yeah, hopefully this talk has shown you that in order to learn from Indigenous people to address the climate crisis, you need to move yourself to action and also to humility. So I just wanted to reiterate that again, scientists will not be leading us in these movements, right? It's going to be elders and activists and farmers and fishers and kama'aina. And then relationships are critical for addressing climate crisis and for Indigenous sovereignty. And Indigenous sovereignty is vital for having good relationships. You need land back. You need to be able to have communities have the power to ask questions and make decisions about their own future and the future of the land. And so if you're a scientist or somebody who is external to an Indigenous community, to work towards this, you can work relationally. You can employ relational co-production, so work on community-led and community-driven and community-supporting research or work, right? Don't just purely try to advance your disembodied scientific agenda. That doesn't work out very well most times. And then work locally and work to build place-based knowledge and place-based relationships. I also included this line, be okay with taking no for an answer, right? Be humble because yeah, this work is a big responsibility and a big privilege. And we're really lucky to have the opportunity to work together to generate abundant responses to the climate crisis. Okay, so that's all. I just before I end, wanted to say thank you very much to everyone who's helped to provide me and a bunch of people in Hawaii with a firm foundation, our friends, our parents, our ancestors, and our akua. And also to all of those committed to forwarding kupuna knowledge and advocating for our communities, which includes Kea that remain standing to affirm Mauna Kea and Hawaiian sovereignty across our islands. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sara. Yeah, I couldn't stop writing some of the quotes or things that you said, especially towards the end. I really appreciate how much of the presentation you spent really being forward thinking and solution oriented as well. So thank you.
Of course, I can share these slides with you if you'd like. And I also have a list of the references I used in the talk in case you want to read them.
Yeah, fantastic. I'll talk to McGillicuddy Center folks after this talk. We generally put the talks on YouTube, but we could easily include some links to some of these resources as well.
Awesome.
So awesome.
Cool.
So yeah, we can transition into some Q&A. I don't, Sara, you probably want a drink or a breather at this point.
Yeah, that was a lot of talking.
Yeah, if folks want to drop questions into the chat, I can moderate or read those. I also realize we're a couple minutes past the top of the hour, so we have seen a drop off in attendance for folks that have classes or have to teach or have meetings. If we do have a smaller group for the next few minutes here for the Q&A, we could use the raise hand function, and especially, like particularly some of the students enrolled in classes can ask you questions. All right. So I can start with one that was sent to me. So yeah, towards the end of the talk, you emphasize the value of long-term thinking. Is this a challenge to maintain this skill and cultivate, especially in the change of rapid decision-making, like the construction of a scientific facility on your land, or even just urgency of the climate crisis?
Yes, that is a great question. And yes, it is a challenge. I think that there's a really big, interesting difference between working in Hawaiian spaces, for example, and working in places like academia. And it's that idea of urgency. Like in academia and like in my work as a scientist, everything is so urgent. We have to operate on these really quick timescales. With policy making, it's usually like a really rapid turnover. You have to get your ideas to the policymakers really early, and then after like a year or so, they kind of move on. Whereas in Hawaiian communities, there's a lot of importance placed on cultivating longer term relationships and working on a longer term timescale to grow your knowledge around a topic. So yeah, it can be really difficult when we as Hawaiians, for example, have a timescale that we prefer to work on and have a timescale for management that we prefer to apply to places like Mauna Kea. But then we come into the spaces that are dominated by people who work on these super fast timescales with lots of urgency, like the state of Hawaii or the 30-meter telescope project, or even like conservation efforts, right? So yeah, it is a big challenge to constantly try to push back against that sense of urgency, and also, maintain our ability to advocate for this long-term type of thinking. But it's a worthwhile challenge. I think you're muted, Katie.
Yes. I don't know if you can keep up with the chat. I sympathize that when you're presenting, it's hard to see more than one or two things on Zoom. Not so much a question, but Margot Lukens expressed thanks. And then also said, I'm teaching a grad class on Wabanaki literature, and I've been trying to inculcate similar kinds of respect and consultative behavior. So much appreciate your admonition to be okay with hearing no as an answer and not attempting to manufacture consent.
Hey, yeah, and that term manufacturing consent was actually something that I was introduced to by Yokepa Kasimbal Salazar, who's a Native Hawaiian scholar, I think in political science. I think he's a professor at UH. But he wrote this paper that talked about manufacturing consent around TMT. And it was like the first time that I, as a younger person and as a scientist, had been like, oh, wow, that explains so much, right? There's also recently a book that somebody published. Their name is Chanda Prescott Weinstein. that talks a bit about what it's like to be, a Black astronomer. But Chanda's also a really big ally for Hawaiians in this TMT issue. And I think Chanda said recently that scientists were not prepared to have no for an answer when they asked us if we wanted this telescope on the mauna. So yeah, that idea of being okay with no, I think is really important, and also an idea that pushes back against that sense of urgency that we have in science and in like US policy. Like we are constantly trying to like push through projects and push through ideas, and sometimes they're not good ideas or people don't want them, and we need to be okay with that. So yeah, I really appreciate that comment. Thanks, Margot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and thanks for joining us today, Margot. I realize you might have just gotten word of these events this morning from the K through 12 and CCI interactions, but yeah, we're glad you're here. All right, so Nola, I see your comment too, so I'll ask that. I wanted to ask in the meantime, another question that was sent to me, because I think it matches this idea of collaboration and consultation and consent, or how those might be in conflict at times. For your work on the policy recommendations around TMT, do you think that came from a place of collaboration?
Oh, yes, it actually really did. Because I'm not an astronomer, right? I'm a historical ecologist. So as we were writing this policy paper with recommendations to one of the premier astronomy associations in the US, we were like, we need to know what astronomers, like where they are, right? Where are they coming from? What's their position on this? So I collaborated with a number of really amazing astronomers on that paper, including Chanda Prescott-Weinstein, Lucianne Welkowicz, Hilde Nielsen, who's actually a Mi'kmaq astronomer based in Toronto, and Mia de los Reyes, and a number of other people. And we, got together and sat down and thought, if the astronomy community were to build a good relationship with Native Hawaiians across the board, what would we like to see coming out of that good relationship? So that paper itself was, I think, a really good example for me of how generative collaboration with people that have a different worldview from me, or like are in a different field, can be. And of course, it wasn't like I was working with like the premier TMT proponents, right? I was working with people who had already internalized this idea that Hawaiian sovereignty is important. So I'm hoping in the future, as the astrodecadal process finishes up, it's still going on. I think it's a really long process for the National Academy to give its recommendations to Congress. Then Congress decides which agencies get funding. But as that continues, I'm looking forward to having more discussions with some of the folks that work on in the existing Mauna Kea observatories about ways that they can move forward. And I've had some of those already. Some folks are really open to hearing what we see as a future for astronomy on the Mauna. That's nice.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Sara. I'll go ahead and hop to, let's see, Nola's comment next, because I know my students enrolled in the class are approaching kind of the end of the contact time this class usually meets. But Nola's expressed, this talk was very informational. Thanks so much. As someone who wants to travel to Hawaii at some point after I graduate, and I know the importance of voting with your wallet, I would love to know more about places and organizations that you feel uphold Native Hawaiian interests and sovereignty.
Oh, yeah, great question. Yeah, tourism is a really big issue in Hawaii. It's our main economy. So I would start out by recommending anybody who travels there to read up on some Hawaiian literature before you go. Haunani K. Trask, I can write that in the chat, is an important thinker in Hawaii who talks a lot about Hawaiian sovereignty and tourism. In terms of voting with your wallet, there's a lot of organizations you can support. I probably can't name all of them, but you can donate directly to Pu'uhuluhulu, which is the Mauna Kea, like the Center for Mauna Kea Action. You can also give to places like Kua, I think it's called Kua Aino Ulu Awamu, is like a Hawaiian organization that works a lot on land-based issues in Hawaii. So they do things like supporting Indigenous agriculture, supporting Indigenous aquaculture, land return, getting people back onto land to build that relationship. There's also, I think, like a large number of Hawaiian sovereignty organizations. We all have different ideas about how to best achieve sovereignty. So I would just recommend looking it up and doing some research and reading. But yeah, I can send a list of places that would appreciate donations to you, Katie, if you'd like to circulate that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see, so at 3:15, this is normally when class would end for students. So I just want to first drop in the chat and respond to folks who have been asking for resources or where they might go to see slides. I've shared the YouTube channel for the McGillicuddy Humanities Center, and it's about 1 week turnaround that we can get the talks up. I would direct you there to check first, and we'll post. I have seen the requests for registrants to be automatically emailed, and it's just a little coordination between 3-4 event staff and like who has all the registration emails. So that might take a little more time than 1 week. I think the most immediate thing you can do is check at the YouTube link for the McGillicuddy Center for the talk. And we can post slides and like some resources there as part of the comments, and then put our heads together if we can send out something more organized afterwards. Yeah, we are still getting questions. I do expect we might see a drop off now for student participants, but I can stay a few more minutes. I do see Elizabeth and Karen, if you have a couple minutes to stick around, we'll get to your questions next. And anybody else that wants to enter the conversation. All right. All right. So yeah, Karen, thanks for attending today and asking. She's asked, how can non-Hawaiian, non-astronomer science support and affirm Native Hawaiians in the conflict with the TMT?
Oh, yeah. There are lots of ways. I think it depends on what your position is, right? You can always donate money to the Kea because like having a movement that's this long takes lots of resources. You have to feed people. When people are physically on the mauna, you have to have shelter and things like that. But also I found that I think one of the really important things in at least my line of work is pushing back against that idea that this is a battle between culture and science, or religion and science is one way that it's been framed, right? So trying to advocate for this more complex way of viewing how Hawaiians feel about TMT, rather than just saying that we are anti-science or really pro-religion or things like that. I think pushing for a more nuanced understanding and trying to advocate for the right of Indigenous people to make decisions about land and to have self-determination. So that's one of the main points I think I wrote in that paper, because I think it's really important, right? Like in any of these big movements, like the current movement to protect water and land where the Line 3 pipeline is going on, the movement for Standing Rock. In Papua, there's this big movement against Indonesian colonization. In all these places, Indigenous people are fighting for Indigenous self-determination and for the right to be seen as fully human, right? The right to make our own decisions and to have the power to determine our future. So yeah, you can like support by donating money, you can support by learning about the conflict and learning about our worldview. But I think one of the biggest things is just to be a huge proponent for Indigenous rights. That can be really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Karen, do you want to add anything or interact? We've got a small size now. I think I might move to asking people to ask their questions, especially some.
Oh, just thank you for that. Thank you for that answer. I've been following this on Twitter and other places. And Chanda Prescott-Weinstein is one of the people who got me interested in the TMT as a non-Native Hawaiian. So yeah, I really appreciate this talk. And I was struck by, in particular, the idea of abundance. It's something that in science, we have so little abundance, or such not much of a mindset of abundance. We have gatekeeping in how our careers progress. We have limited funding that we're all competing for. And it's just such a, it seems like it would be difficult to overcome the idea of scarcity in Western science. So that is a good challenge for me to, and others, I think, to think about and work on.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Yeah, that scarcity mindset seems to be a part of so much of US and, like life in general. And particularly in science. I'm a PhD student. We like see those, the scarcity narratives all the time. And yeah, it's important for me, like even just for making sure that I'm being imaginative in my research, right? Thinking about abundance has been a really great exercise. Instead of being like, oh, what is this? What am I missing? I can say, oh, what like generative things am I trying to look for in this? And I don't know, that framing's been helpful, especially as I try to like combat climate anxiety. So I've actually really, really enjoyed reading Auntie Candace's book. I like keep it next to my desk when I'm sad because it's a good reminder that abundance exists. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I'll bounce next to Elizabeth. Thanks for attending today. Elizabeth is enrolled in one of my other grad classes, but she'd like to ask a question.
Yeah, first, mahalo for the presentation. I found this really, really helpful. And I especially kind of connected with the points you're making about how hard it is to develop a relational perspective, because we're absolutely not trained to do it at all. And it's something I've been trying to do more and more, especially since working in places like the Western Pacific, like the Hawaiian Islands. But my comment is that as you were describing what community-based science looks like, it really made me think about the difference between collaborative science and science as service, and who's empowering those in those arrangements.
Yeah, I think that's a really great way of phrasing it. Yeah, because it's, like we a lot of times will go into communities and say, oh, here, we know what we need. Let's go. Here's our plan. Here's our research plan. Here's our policy recommendations. But yeah, science as service is like this really great mindset. Is I think that gets back to why, that's at least why I do science, right? I'm here because I want to learn something about the world that will help me help my community. So yeah, it makes that that difficulty of learning how to be relational slightly more straightforward. But yeah, I don't know, I'm probably being incoherent, but I really appreciate that comment. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, we'll hop next to Kate. Did you want to ask your question? Kate Christian?
Sure. Oh gosh, terrible. There are so many things, and the abundance scarcity part is, I'd love to talk more about that actually, but my question was a particular one about your numbers on the indigenous land. You said 22%, there was a 22% and an 80%, and I'm already 4 pages beyond that in notes, but I wrote it in the chat. What does it say, Katie? Sorry.
Let's see.
Oh, yeah. So you said, is that indigenous land is 80% of world biodiversity? Is that a percent for indigenous controlled land? Yeah, so I actually got that from, I don't think I cited it, did I? I got that from a UN report on, I think it's from the UN DRIP, but maybe it's from the Directive on the Rights of Indigenous People, but it might be from their Biodiversity Initiative. Basically showing that, if you look at the 22% of the land worldwide that is controlled by and managed by indigenous people, that land itself holds 80% of known global biodiversity.
Okay, so the 22% is land controlled by indigenous, where there's some setup of land rights in the sort of modern land rights, or whatever words I should be using here. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
The scarcity and abundance, I would just add, I think about this a lot. I have been for a long time. And I think this abundance part is really, it's when you switch to that, what you're starting to think about is abundance of us as part of nature. Like that's and I'm sure these great resources you're telling about that you can write, talk about that, but it really is a major switch that is, it's a wonderful new framing. It's a really great way to think about it. And also, like you say, to get past climate anxiety. What's the great word for climate anxiety? There's a beautiful word for it. That,
is it solastalgia?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've never heard that before.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Oh,
I
right.
hadn't either. It's,
Yeah,
you know, it's the things you learn when you have really smart students that enroll in your climate change class. You learn from them.
But
So
thank you.
yeah,
Thank you
student
so
last
much.
year.
I'm working on a project on the boreal, and I just wish, I'm just looking for like all the same things you were talking about in terms of that. So yeah,
Awesome. Good luck. I'm looking forward to seeing it in the future.
thanks.
All right. And so I have one last question. Gabby had to, it looks like Gabby is not here anymore. She likely had to leave the call. Another PhD candidate that's enrolled in one of my classes, but she has asked, or first she expressed, thank you so much for your talk. I think your comments around place-based knowledge was really powerful for me, particularly since I work in fisheries management, which often try to cultivate governance across multiple communities in large areas. How should scientists shape their work that crosses multiple communities or spaces, recognizing that collaboration often comes with inherent power struggles?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would go back to that place-based and like the local and indigenous framing, right? So if you're working across multiple communities, I think you have even more work cut out for you because you need to develop relationships with all of those communities. And as kind of an aside, this is actually something that is like a big issue in like Native Pacific relations too, right? So like Oceania is a region that has lots of like huge fishery zones. It was strategically colonized for like European and like US like colonizing nations to get access to fisheries. And there's a bunch of different ideas between each of the island nations in the Pacific about what fisheries management should look like. And that's because each of those places has a different context. And so like, as I've heard people say things like, you know, we can take like Hawaiian aquaculture practices and apply that to the whole Pacific. And I don't think that's true. Hawaiian aquaculture practices are for Hawaii. And there are even different aquaculture practices for different islands because our islands are different. So I think it's that same idea of instead of having this mindset that our science needs to be generalizable and scalable, which is something that kind of gets pushed on us, right? Like the highest profile papers in science tend to be the ones that are like global analyses or global predictions or whatever. I think instead of having that idea that we need to be generalizing things, it's okay for us to give ourselves space to be more fine-grained and have more complexity in that in our work. So yeah, so if you're working across multiple communities and multiple spaces, I would definitely recommend trying to build up relationships with each of those communities and try to advocate, like if you're in a position of power to try to advance policy, for example, learn from each of those communities what they think would be most applicable and what their goals are for a fishery, and then try to advocate for that. I don't know, it's messy work, right? It's going to be individual and it's going to be incredibly contextual. Like each place will be different, each day will be different. So that's, I don't know, how I would approach it, yeah.
Thanks so much. Have we got any other questions for the Q&A after Sada's talk? All right, well, I'll go ahead and formally say thanks again to speakers, to Laura and Michael and others that have helped with this event. And then thanks to the audience for joining us today.